Hello everyone. I'm just gonna figure out, okay, there we go. So we're over here at Myrtle Grove Cemetery today. Before we get started, we'll just kind of show a little bit of video of where we're at. And then we'll be talking with Milt, who's a volunteer here at the cemetery, about the different projects that are going on, some of the history of the cemetery, all kinds of good spooky information. So we'll just turn the camera around so you guys can see where we're at. It's a pretty nice day out here. It's really sunny, but it's kind of chilly. Good autumn day. We'll go ahead and get started here in a couple minutes. Welcome to Myrtle Grove Cemetery over here in Eureka. It's a really nice day out here today. Alright, so it's just about 2, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome again, everyone. It's the Clark Museum Ask the Curator. Today we'll be able to ask Milt here some questions about Myrtle Grove Cemetery, the early cemetery here for Eureka. So if you have any questions along the way, feel free to put them in the comments section and I'll go ahead and ask Milt. And yeah, thank you for joining us. All right, Milt, you ready?
I'm ready.
All right.
Hey. Good afternoon and welcome to Myrtle Grove Memorial Cemetery. For those of you who are not familiar with the history of the cemetery, it was established in 1861 and the local citizens who established this first cemetery in Eureka purposely chose this location here near Myrtle and West because it was going to be far removed from the city and not subject to future urban encroachment. And as you can see now, the city has grown up around the cemetery, and the cemetery, when it was established, it was a private subscription cemetery. So a group of local citizens purchased the land and divided it into plots and then sold the plots to individual citizens and individual families. Also, a number of the fraternal lodges in Eureka, the Masonic Lodge, the Oddfellows Lodge, the Orange Lodge, they bought plots of land here in the cemetery for use either by their members or their families, and also to sell individual plots then to just the general public. And it was a way for the lodges to recoup the cost on their acquisition, as well as make some money for the lodge and provide a public service in terms of a burial place in Eureka. So you might in a way say it was sort of a early day land speculation, real estate dealing. But the cemetery was successful, and most of the plots in the cemetery had been sold by 1890, and that led then to the establishment in 1891 of Ocean View Cemetery in the south part of Eureka. So business was good here at the cemetery, and as we like to say, it was very popular. People were just dying to get in. So the cemetery continued to fill up, but part of the feature of the fact that it was a private cemetery was that the individual plot owners were responsible for the improvement and the maintenance of their plot. So as the years passed, various first wooden fences and wooden borders and then concrete borders were placed around individual plots. Shrubbery and landscaping was planted, and this is sort of the way that the cemetery looked in 1946 in this Merle Schuster aerial photo. If you can imagine what it looked like, it was sort of like you would find at the cemetery in Ferndale now, where there's lots of above ground improvements. So as it was built out, and you'll notice that there's trees and other vegetation, and there's hedges along the sides of the cemetery, and up until perhaps the 1910s, 20s, 30s, this was a relatively undeveloped portion of town, so there was not a lot of ambient light at night, and there weren't street lights like there are now, and so at night the cemetery was a particularly foreboding and dark place, especially inside, sheltered with all the vegetation and the headstones and other improvements. So it was some place that, especially at night, was to be avoided. So over the years, the various families that owned plots passed on or lost interest in maintenance, and so the cemetery fell on some bad times over the years, and there was a lack of maintenance. Some of the maintenance and upkeep of the cemetery, as well as the digging of the graves for people who were going to be buried here, was all carried on privately. And over the years, there were a number of gentlemen who were known as sextons. And so this is our cemetery word for the day. The sexton, if you're familiar with churches, is the person who takes care of the physical plant of the church, responsible for maintenance and other projects around the church. And so it was much the same here at the cemetery. A sexton was employed by the Myrtle Grove Cemetery Association, and the sexton was responsible for upkeep, and much of his salary was earned by digging graves and arranging for burials. We have the good fortune of having the sexton's original record book. Is still in existence, and it documents burials starting in the 1880s all the way to after 1910, 1920s and 30s. So a lot of the burial information can be gathered from the sexton's book. So there are about 6,000 people buried here at the cemetery. About 2,200 of those burials have headstones, and so you can see around the cemetery here how the headstones are scattered. Not all graves when they were established had headstones. Families could choose to put a headstone or not. Many of the headstones in the early days were made out of wood and so deteriorated over the years. But we do have some fairly good records. As I said, there's about 6,000 burials, and through the work of volunteers, we have good burial locations for about 4,800 of those 6,000. And a lot of that information can be found on a site called Find a Grave. You just go to the website and search for the Myrtle Grove Cemetery, and you can see burial information, biographical information, photographs about, as I said, about 4,800 people. All of the visible headstones at Myrtle Grove are on Find a Grave, as well as records for a number of other burials where we have the burial record, but we don't know the exact location of the grave, or there's not a headstone. So in recent years, it's been the work of volunteers who have helped to rehabilitate the cemetery. Starting in 2015, a group of volunteers led by Kirby Nunn started raising headstones. When the cemetery in 1957 was, as I call it, modernized, a lot of the upright headstones were laid flat. A lot of the above ground improvements were removed, and the cemetery was converted to what you see today in terms of flat lawn areas. It was all part of a movement in cemeteries at that time in terms of perpetual care, removing the improvements that caused maintenance issues. So at that time, the cemetery, the appearance of the cemetery was changed from this. This is some scenes that were taken around 1910. These are above ground burial vaults and other things, and all these above ground improvements. You can see in the background of this picture some nearby area here that has been recently logged. So the cemetery here was established on land that what was forested at one time. When it was established in the early 1860s, they had to remove the stumps that were left. Wow. And the name Myrtle Grove, as applied to this area, was because of the profusion of myrtle trees and myrtle bushes. So we have worked on raising headstones, improving the area, documenting burials, and just generally making this cemetery have a better appearance. Recognizing that there's a lot of heritage here, local history here. Anybody who was in Eureka, who died in Eureka before about 1890, is likely buried here. You can walk through and you can read headstones and read names, and you can see all sorts of names that are recognizable in terms of pioneers in Eureka. Another important feature of the cemetery is the veterans that are buried here. There's over 230 veterans buried here at the cemetery, veterans of the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, the Indian Wars, World War I, and World War II.
Wow.
And so you find Civil War veterans here, the majority of whom were who came to Humboldt County after the Civil War.
Wow.
So they're from Kansas and Iowa and Nebraska and Minnesota, and you see these veterans with their distinctive headstones. And so part of the ongoing research is to document where these Civil War veterans came from and what the battles were that they participated in during the Civil War.
Wow.
It's a very rich history and heritage. So in recognition of the veterans, the last few years we've had public programs on both Memorial Day and Veterans Day. And this is the declaration of the the graves. These are the veterans' graves, who are all decorated with American flags for each grave. And then we've had a public program about the veterans of World War I, or the veterans of the Spanish-American War, or something similar. So with the current COVID crisis, we've not been able to do a program this year on Memorial Day, and we won't be able to do one upcoming for Veterans Day in terms of a public program. But we do have volunteers who will place the flags on the graves, and on Veterans Day, Wednesday, November 11th, the cemetery will be open. You can come in and take a look at the decorations and do some exploring. The cemetery is open 365 days a year, from about 8:30 in the morning to 3:30 in the afternoon. It's 10 acres of valuable urban open space here in Eureka. There's improved roads that go through the cemetery. We don't have a fitness course established yet in terms of how many feet or how many miles you can walk on the roads, but it is a nice place to come. You're certainly welcome to come and explore and eat your lunch, and do something in terms of both learning as well as respecting those who are buried here. So we do have a Facebook page, and Myrtle Grove Memorial Cemetery. You can like our Facebook page and receive information about programs. We're always on the lookout for anyone who'd like to volunteer. There's not a lot of activity going on right now, but if you can volunteer and learn a little bit about the cemetery, and then when we get back into some more public activity, participate in that too. So this is the Facebook page, and you can also email us at myrtlegroveeureka@gmail. And if you have any questions about the cemetery, if you want to know if there's relatives that are buried here, anything you might want to know about the cemetery, the volunteers are more than happy to help. So I did want to talk just briefly about, since this is Halloween time, how Halloween relates to the cemetery. And so a little bit of research that I did recently is that the history of Halloween, in terms of what we know today in terms of costumes and parties and trick-or-treating, that's only within the very recent history of Halloween. Originally it was the evening before All Souls Day, or All Saints Day, All Hallows Day, which was a day to remember the deceased. And so it evolved over the years, and primarily was a religious holiday to begin with. And so a Humboldt Times article in 1892 notes that it is this All Hallows Eve, but says that Monday night will be Halloween, Tuesday, November 1st being All Saints Day. This evening is extensively observed in European countries and in some of the New England and other eastern states, but is rarely observed on this coast. So that was the case. Most of the activity that occurred on the West Coast and in areas like this was private parties where friends would gather and engage in fall activities, such as a party that was held at the Hamilton home on J Street in 1913, where witches, ghosts, hobgoblins, and various other grotesque characters wended their way towards the spacious Hamilton home, given by Mrs. Alice Lambert and Mabel Hamilton. About 20 guests were present, all going attired in various fantastic costume, and a very merry time was enjoyed, with games appropriate to the occasion. The social hall on the third floor of the Hamilton home was profusely decorated with all sorts of emblems and characters of the festive feast, and was the scene of the festivities. So it was a time for private parties, for sort of fall merrymaking, which was consistent with the fact that it was sort of a fall harvest festival at times. But the things you associate with Halloween nowadays certainly weren't part of that history. But as I said before, Myrtle Grove Cemetery, ghosts have always been associated with cemeteries, and so in terms of cultural icons and that sort of thing, that's kind of how Halloween and cemeteries kind of melded. But as I said before, in terms of the development of the cemetery and where it was located, and it being a dark and frankly scary space, that Myrtle Grove Cemetery doesn't let you down in that regard. In 1909, the matriarch of a prominent Italian family here in Eureka was contacted by someone who said that they were part of an Italian, I guess you'd call it an Italian gang, who would bring bad fortune upon her family if she didn't turn over a large sum of money. So it was an extortion scheme of some sort. So she was scared, and she went to the police, and the police did some investigation, and they decided to set up a sting for the perpetrator. And so the perpetrator told her that to put the money in a black valise and to place it at a certain place within Myrtle Grove Cemetery. And so the police did that, and then they staked out the cemetery, waiting for the perpetrator to come and retrieve the money. Now it was, of course, dark, and so the newspaper reports say that the police chief, Chief Cloney, and one of his policemen, that they laid on the ground all night, hidden behind headstones, waiting for the thief to come and claim the money. Well, he never showed up. But he got increasingly bold and started trying to extort some shopkeepers in Old Town. And so the police managed to put some clues together, two and two together, and so shopkeeper was going to pay him some money and sent it by registered mail, and told him to go to the post office to claim it. And so when he did, the police were waiting. But that's one of the things that has happened at Myrtle Grove Cemetery in the past. But a few years later, in 1914, some circumstances, they weren't quite as good. A young couple were walking on Myrtle Avenue on the wooden sidewalks that were along Myrtle Avenue, walking home from visiting her relatives who lived nearby. And a former boyfriend jumped out from the shadows at the entrance to the cemetery on Myrtle Grove Avenue and shot the couple. She was badly wounded, and with the sound of the shots, a small crowd started to gather, and at that point someone was driving by, 1914, and immediately they put the young woman in his car, and he drove her to Sequoia Hospital at 6th and H Street in downtown. And so she eventually recovered, from her wounds, but it wasn't until the police arrived that the police arrived that the boyfriend, who had been shot by this assailant, realized that he was wounded also. And the assailant had fled in here into the cemetery, into the darkness of the cemetery, with all these places behind headstones to hide and all this vegetation. And so the police were busy trying to locate and apprehend the assailant. So the boyfriend who had been shot also went to the hospital on a streetcar. The streetcar line ran here on Myrtle Avenue. The electric streetcar was established here on Myrtle Avenue in 1908, ran out as far as Harrison Avenue. So he went to the hospital on the streetcar, and the police searched through the dark cemetery all night trying to find the assailant, and finally, shortly before daybreak, they did. So it may not be a Halloween story, but it's a story of dark and foreboding Myrtle Grove Cemetery. I might also say that I personally am very interested in this cemetery. My grandparents moved to a house about 2 blocks from here in 1919. They had lived at 6th and T Street on the other side of Franklin School and County Education Complex now. But they moved to West Avenue in 1919, and then my mother was born in that house, and in 1950 she and my father constructed their home about a block away from here. That's where I was raised. And so my grandfather, one of the things that he did also was he, as a member of the community here, was one of the first presidents of the Myrtle Grove Improvement Association in the 1920s, the Myrtle Avenue Improvement Association. He helped maintain some of the graves here for various out-of-town friends. But so the cemetery has been part of this neighborhood and part of my family for a little bit over 100 years, and that's why I'm so interested in perpetuating the history and the legacy of the cemetery.
Very cool.
So with that, you now know a little bit more about the cemetery, and Katie and I will try to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, so let's see. So one of them is kind of a two-part. Emily and Alex ask, is the cemetery haunted, and do they still bury people here?
Well, I can't speak about haunting, but I think that the spirit of thousands of people continue to live here, and the more that you know about the history of the cemetery and the people that are buried here, you can see how important it is to Eureka. And the answer to the second question is that the cemetery was officially legally closed by the city about 10 years ago, and so there are no additional formal burials occurring here, and that was, in large part an administrative decision on the part of the city, because if you are an active cemetery, there's all sorts of rules and regulations you have to follow, and it was something that the city decided that they didn't want to be in the cemetery business. They're in a lot of other businesses, but not the cemetery business. But there are 2 burials that will occur here in the future. One of the families who have a number of relatives buried here in 1957, when the Cemetery Association got all of the owners of the cemetery plots to agree to relinquish their rights, and then eventually turn it over, the grounds over to the city. One of those families negotiated with the city for a couple of their family members to be buried here in the future, and there's still 2 family members who are living and will be buried here in the future if they so choose.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. And then Peg says, thanks, Milt. Great stories and excellent graphics. Can you talk a bit about the mausoleums and their original occupants?
Good question.
So, like, there's 2 of them kind of back there. There's one right
5
there.
mausoleums presently here at the cemetery. Off in the distance there is the Booner family mausoleum. Directly in front of it, the smaller one, is the Engel mausoleum. The one over here is the Carson mausoleum. Then turning to the southeast here is the Vance mausoleum, and we're standing directly in front of the Ricks mausoleum. All of these mausoleums were constructed in the 1890s to 1910 time frame, at a period when, for instance, in the case of the Carson family, William Carson died in 1912. So when this mausoleum was constructed, he was, sort of at the pinnacle of his business career here in Eureka. And so, of course, the Vance family, not to be outdone by the Carsons, they had to construct theirs. And then the Booner family. And then the Ricks mausoleum here was in honor of Casper Ricks, he and others in his family were early pioneers here in Eureka that contributed a lot to the business community and the growth of the infrastructure here in Eureka. The outlier here is the small Ingalls mausoleum, and actually there were never any Ingalls family members permanently entombed there, as well as not anyone else. Mr. Ingalls was an undertaker here in Eureka.
Oh.
And built this mausoleum as a temporary resting place for people who were going to be buried here before their graves were dug or before their bodies were shipped elsewhere.
Oh.
So it's a sort of it's the mausoleum motel, sort of. But then there is one other mausoleum that we can't show you, that stood over near the entrance to the cemetery. What you can see in the background there is the old Franklin School, Franklin Elementary School. Directly opposite on Myrtle Avenue is the main entrance to the cemetery. And standing near there was the mausoleum of the Kimball family. And there's a couple of pictures, old pictures of the Kimball mausoleum in the background. One picture taken when the streetcar lines were being laid in 1908. Another picture from the 1920s. But at some point, at least before the 1947-46 aerial photo was taken, the Kimball mausoleum was removed. We don't know why. We don't know where it went. But it was reportedly constructed of pink marble.
Oh. Fancy.
And so, again, we don't know the fate of that mausoleum, but we like to say that if you have any pink marble in your home, take a careful look at it and determine where it came from.
Oh my gosh.
But there are Kimball family members buried over in that area where the mausoleum previously stood.
Huh. All right, and then we have one more question. Are there plans to put grave markers in the future for graves that have lost their markers or never had one originally?
The The short answer to that is yes. The more complicated answer is how, when, who, and how much.
Yeah.
Currently, the markers that are here are being maintained. There are, and a number of them have been restored, that were laid down, have been stood up and restored. A number of them were broken and have been restored. And there's a number of instances where the markers that are here, there needs to be some serious maintenance done on them. You can't see any offhand here, but there's ones that the ground has settled around large markers that are sitting askew.
Oh yeah,
they
like
need to
that
be
one.
leveled and the ground underneath them restored. That's an effort that needs to be undertaken. The opportunity for family members or friends to place a marker on a grave that does not already have one, that opportunity exists, but it's entirely dependent upon the ability of the volunteers to place that. The city of Eureka does own the property now, and but as I said, the city is certainly not in the cemetery business, and so maintaining it in its status quo is about the best the city can do at the moment. If there were private or public funds available to increase these efforts, that would be highly desirable. But at this point, there's just not the funding to be able to do things like that. There's also a number of other improvements that should be made here at the cemetery. The mausoleums need to be inspected for water leakage. Several of them need new roofs. There's the ongoing maintenance costs of the mowing the lawn, and which is all done by volunteers at the moment. It would be desirable to have the roads paved, but that's not on the table immediately. So anything that anyone can do in terms of providing volunteer support or helping secure some financial support for the cemetery would be a real good thing.
So we have a question. Why is there a cannon in the cemetery? I don't think there's a cannon here.
I think what they might be referring to is we have a newly placed commemorative bench here in the cemetery, which was placed by the relative of one of the folks that's buried here in the cemetery, and it has wagon wheels, granite wagon wheels on the end of it, and so that's what you might be thinking looks like a cannon, but it's a commemorative bench honoring her pioneer ancestors.
Okay. And then, is there any way to locate unmarked graves?
Yes. A very absolute positive yes to that. We have, as I said, we have the sexton's records. We have some incredible research that was done by Karen Hendricks and some other women who documented, who went to a number of sources, newspaper obituaries, the sexton's book, other miscellaneous records, and compiled a list of everyone who can be documented as being buried in the cemetery. That work was supplemented then when Kirby Nunn took over leadership in terms of the cemetery project here. Kirby did some more work on that. We have the maps that were prepared in 1957 before the cemetery was restored that documented where headstones were. so that they could be placed back in the same location. So we have those records. There's it's not all in one place, but there is a myriad of records. And if you send an email to our email address with as much information as you have or whatever your question is, we can help you as best we can.
All right. Well, awesome. Thanks for sharing with us today, Milt. And thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope you learned something new. I definitely did. And we hope to see you on the next episode of Ask the Curator with the Clark Museum and possible guest speakers. It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Milt.
Thank you.